Hello, class! Today we're talking about Peter van Inwagen's article on the possibility of the resurrection of the dead. Here's some study guide questions to help us get started. 1. What is the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? 2. What is van Inwagen's thesis about the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? 3. What is the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? 4. How does van Inwagen explain his thesis using a manuscript as an example? 5. Why does van Inwagen reject the claim that the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is a theological mystery? 6. What, according to van Inwagen, is the correct criterion of personal identity? 7. What is van Inwagen's main argument against the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? 8. What is van Inwagen's A objection to the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? 9. What is van Inwagen's B objection to the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? 10. What is van Inwagen's C objection to the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? 11. Which possibility does van Inwagen ultimately suggest to make sense of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead? Alright, as usual, when I go over the answers to these questions, you'll want to write them down, type them up, crochet them into a sweater, hammer them into an ice sculpture, some way of remembering them and compartmentalizing them as we go through. So, the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is an old doctrine, and it can be found in the earliest versions of Christianity. It's a view about the afterlife, or more appropriately, a view about existing after you're dead, but it is not, or at least not necessarily, a mind-body dualist view. In other words, it's a doctrine about existing after you're dead that doesn't involve any souls or spirits or immaterial selves or beings or anything like that. The doctrine of the resurrection of the dead says this, that after the final day, God will bring it about that every person who has ever lived will live again. And the idea is that the second time around, when God resurrects all of the dead, their bodies will be incorruptible in the hereafter. That's the idea. Incorruptible in the final kingdom. Now, van Inwagen argues that the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead, at least in its most common interpretations, is false. That it simply cannot be true, and moreover, the reason why it cannot be true is it violates the correct standard of personal identity. That is, the correct standard for telling when a person is the same from one moment to the next gets violated by the standard interpretations of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. Now, the standard interpretation that van Inwagen has in mind is what he and we will call the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. And that interpretation goes like this. Here's the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. That after the last day, God will bring it about that every person who has ever lived will live again. And moreover, God will bring this about by taking all of the material atoms and energy which constituted those people and rearranging it so that those people are built out of those atoms and that energy again. So if you imagine people all throughout history are made of little atoms in the same way that a toy might be made of Legos, and as those people die and fall apart, their Legos, their atoms get scattered, this version of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead says, well, here's what God does after the apocalypse. After the apocalypse, God takes everyone's atoms, all the Legos throughout the universe, and everyone who has ever existed, anyone who has ever made of Legos, gets built out of those Legos again, and there they are, existing once more, only this time their Legos won't fall apart. That's the basic idea. Mortal corruption is the dissolution of material elements, and that the resurrection of the dead is their reintegration God rebuilds all the people, so to speak. Now, why doesn't Van Inwagen think this works? Well, he uses an example, a toy example, involving a manuscript before jumping into human beings. The example with the manuscript goes like this. Suppose that today, in a museum, there were a manuscript, and that the caretakers said that that manuscript was burned, completely incinerated in the 5th century CE. Now, how could that be possible? How could it be that a manuscript was burned, completely burned to ashes in the 5th century, and yet is here intact in the museum? How could that even occur? Well, suppose that there were a real miracle involved. Suppose that God actually took all of the little ashen particles and all of the energy released from the combustion of that manuscript and took it and then reassembled it into an object. That thing that's in the museum. Van Inwagen says, even in that case, the thing that's in the museum would not be the same manuscript as the original. Here's why. The original had ink marks on it, and those ink marks, the arrangement of the ink particles, was the direct result of St. Augustine pressing his pen to the parchment. It is St. Augustine's pressing the pen to the parchment and moving it around that caused the ink marks to be as they are, and not some other way, and which made it into a manuscript. If God takes a bunch of ashes and assembles them into a manuscript, then the arrangement of the ink on that parchment is not the result of the press of St. Augustine's hand. It's not the result of anyone writing, actually. It's not even a manuscript. And here, Van Inwagen makes a fun comparison with a child's stack of blocks. Say my nephew is playing with blocks and stacks a little castle and then has to go to school, and I, being the oafish, clumsy dork I am, trip over those blocks and I knock them over. I panic, and then I quickly stack the blocks just as they were, and then my friend comes over. My friend, being an odd person, says, "Hey, nice castle made out of blocks. Did your nephew make that?" I would have to answer, no. I knocked over the one my nephew made. I made that one, but please don't tell him. In the same way that the original, the blocks were positioned by my nephew, and that's what made it that stack of blocks, and the later stack were the blocks where positioning was due to my arrangement, that makes it a different stack of blocks, so it is in the case of the parchment. In the original parchment, the ink was arranged as a result of St. Augustine's handwriting, but in the recreation, the ink was arranged as a result of what God did, not the same manuscript. And again, as Van Inwagen says, the second isn't even really a manuscript. Now, Van Inwagen anticipates a certain objection. Suppose a person says, look, it doesn't matter how God did this, God did it. It's a mystery. And here the word mystery doesn't mean a puzzle or a whodunit. Here, the word mystery is a technical term. It refers to matters of divinity which, because of their nature, lie beyond mortal understanding. Van Inwagen does believe in mysteries. Van Inwagen, as he writes, is willing to concede that the doctrine of the incarnation, how Jesus became immortal, that's a mystery. That's beyond our mortal understanding. He also says that the Trinity is a mystery. That, too, is beyond his mortal understanding. But the reason why those are mysteries is because they have to do with the divine nature. They have to do with what God is intrinsically. If someone said God could make a four-sided triangle and it's just a mystery how, or that God could create two mountains without a valley in between and it's just a mystery how, Van Inwagen would dismiss that as rubbish. Because although the divine nature might not be within human comprehension, and that might be beyond human understanding, triangles, mountains, valleys, those are not divine objects. Their nature is scrutable to us. We might not know about how three divine persons can be one divine being, but we do know about triangles, mountains, and manuscripts. So, the reason why it's not a divine mystery is because a divine mystery has to concern the intrinsic nature of God. And this doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is not a puzzle about God's nature, it's a puzzle about things like bodies and manuscripts. Now, just as it is for manuscripts, so it is for people. Over the course of history, people live and then they die, and once they die, their ashes and their atoms dissolve and are scattered. And in the same way that God could not make it the case that the same manuscript exists just by reassembling the atoms, nor, claims Van Inwagen, could God make it the case that you existed again just by reassembling your atoms after you died. Someone would exist, says Van Inwagen, if God took all the atoms that made you up when you were alive, and then, thousands of years after your death, reassembled them into a living person. Well, you'd have a living person, all right, but that person would not be you. At least, not according to what Van Inwagen thinks the correct standard is for personal identity. Now, what's Van Inwagen's criterion of personal identity? He doesn't phrase it exactly this way, but we're going to phrase it formally in order to be as clear as possible. Here it is. It's a biological criterion of personal identity, and it goes like this. If X at time t is the same person as Y at a later time t2, then the features and the activities of Y's biological parts at t2 are the result of the features and the activities of X's biological parts at t. In other words, consider someone at a time. Consider me on Thursday. On Thursday, let's say exactly at 10:56 a.m., I have a certain positioning amongst my bodily parts. I've got a certain amount of blood this way, and it's rushing that way, and I've got my organs here, and I've got oxygen in my blood there, and I've got neurons firing here. Imagine a snapshot of my biological reality, and note the positioning of all the different chemicals, fluids, and bits in there. What Van Inwagen is saying is this. If I, on Thursday morning at 10:56, am the same person as someone on Monday, then the reason why my organs and little bits are positioned this way must be causally connected to how the organs and the little bits of that person on Monday were. And taken together, these activities which are responsible for maintaining the little bits and pieces and determining where they are, taken together, those activities are the processes that constitute me being alive. So we might paraphrase Van Inwagen's criterion of personal identity like this, that X at t is the same person as Y at a later time t2, just as long as Y's biological processes at t2 are a continuation of X's biological processes at t. Or to put it more simply, they're the same person provided that they are sustained by the same life processes over time. Now the problem with the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is that it occurs long after all of anyone's biological processes have stopped. Not only stopped, but the little bits that make up a person have been completely scattered, so they can play no role in the arrangement of those bits later after the resurrection. Van Inwagen mentions that if a person dies on the hospital table and their life processes stop, they can be resuscitated and still be the same person. That's because not much has changed. The body has not begun to putrefy, its integrity has not begun to break down. If the person is resuscitated, then by and large, the positioning of their blood and their organs and their breath and all of that, that's still due to previous stages in their biology. That's still the sustenance of their life. It's just that it had a little artificial help to jump in and make sure it kept going. But the processes were still continued. So you can have little interruptions in someone's biology, but what you can't have is total bodily disruption, where the body itself is disintegrated and scattered, and then later reassembled and it's the same thing. That's the thing that can't happen. So here's Van Inwagen's main arguments from this paper. First, if the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is true, then a person who exists before the last day is the same as a person who exists after the last day, too. But a person X at time t is the same person as a person Y at a later time t2 if and only if Y's biological processes at t2 are a continuation of X's biological processes at t3. When a person exists after the last day, their biological processes are the result of God's actions alone and not the result of any biological processes from before the last day. So, no person who exists after the last day can be the same person as any person who exists before the last day. So, the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead is not true. And that's Van Inwagen's argument. Or at least that's the main argument against the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. In the same way that if you knock down your nephew's stack of blocks and then you rebuilt them, that would be a different stack of blocks because the arrangement of those blocks was your doing and you caused those blocks to be there. Whereas before, the blocks arrangement were due to your nephew, and so it was your nephew's stack of blocks. Same sort of thing going on here. Before the resurrection of the dead, your blocks, so to speak, were the arrangement of your biology. Your biology, your biological processes, and your life, in the biological sense, is why your parts are arranged this way. After the last day, however, when God points at all of the ashes in the world and says, "Up and at 'em," and makes a bunch of people, those people's little biological bits are arranged as a result of God's actions, not your life. So they're all a bunch of new people. This is why he says the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead cannot work. Now, in addition, there are 3 other arguments that Van Inwagen gives, labeled A, B, and C. Those aren't really helpful labels, but labeled A, B, and C, and let's go over them real fast too. These are additional arguments against the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. They're not as persuasive, at least according to Van Inwagen himself, but they're really neat, so let's talk about them. Argument A, let's say A stands for annihilation. Van Inwagen points out that atoms, or whatever it is that makes you up, those are not necessary beings. They are contingent beings. They might not have existed, and perhaps through breaking them down into smaller particles or energizing them or something, you could destroy the particles that you're made of. If the Aristotelian doctrine of the resurrection of the dead worked, through reassembling atoms, well then you could escape the afterlife just by making sure that you jumped into some kind of particle accelerator before you died, or make sure that someone annihilated your atoms. But that would be absurd. That would be ridiculous if you just needed sci-fi technology to escape God's wrath. So much the worse for the Aristotelian doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. Objection B has to do with cannibalism. It should have been objection C, right? But B stands for bloodthirsty, which is what cannibals are. Let's say that. So objection B points out that atoms are recycled throughout different people and different life forms over time. Think of Mufasa's speech from The Circle of Life, the original one, not the new one. The lions die, and their bodies become the grass, and then the antelope eat the grass, and so those same atoms that used to be the lion's body and then became the grass now become the antelope, and it's all swished around, and everyone exchanges parts. So here's a problem with the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. Suppose that Sir Isaac Newton had a bunch of atoms that made up his right arm, and later on, as happenstance, my left arm is made up of those same atoms. Right? The very same atoms. Well, that's cool, but what happens after the last day? God is trying to make sure that everyone who has ever lived is present. He's got this stack of atoms, and he's wondering, well, do I use these atoms to make Sir Isaac Newton's arm or to make Dr. Bauer's arm? How do I decide? If I make Sir Isaac Newton's arm, then I can't make Dr. Bauer's arm. He's going to be missing an arm, and vice versa. Worse still, if a person wanted to escape God's wrath, they would just have to make sure that this is true with all their body parts. Just become a lifelong cannibal, make sure that all the atoms at any time that make you up were largely composed of other people, and you'll be set. You don't have to worry about being punished by God or anything. Again, it's a silly objection. That's why it's sort of at the end and just sort of offered as an additional argument. But it's creative and neat. So we've got A for annihilation, B for bloodthirsty cannibals, and C for chronological weirdness. So, Just as the same group of atoms can compose different people at different times, so it is that different groups of atoms compose the same person at different times. The atoms that made me up when I was 5 years old, for instance, are not in my body now, nor are the atoms which will make me up when I'm 60. So here's another problem, and this might remind you of some objections from John Perry, that if the Aristotelian interpretation of the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead were true, then it would be possible to have two distinct beings that are both numerically identical to Jason Bowers. All God would have to do is take the atoms that composed me when I was 5, reassemble those, and then take the atoms that composed me when I'm 60, and reassemble those. And voila! Per absurdum, now we have two distinct individuals, one 5 years old, one 60 years old, and they are both the very same one and only one Dr. Jason Bowers. No, that's impossible. Cannot be. So here's a case where if the Aristotelian doctrine of the resurrection of the dead were true, it would entail the possibility of something which should be logically impossible. Again, so much the worse for the doctrine. On a final note, Van Inwagen does not give up on the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. He says that the Aristotelian interpretation of it is wrong, but not that he disbelieves the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead. For Van Inwagen, or at least this is what Van Inwagen suggests, the doctrine of the resurrection of the dead could happen if, say, God just saves a part of you. Just saves a part of you for later. Maybe right before you die, God swaps out your brain and your central nervous system to save that so that he can resurrect you later with it. I guess that would mean a simulacra brain, a fake brain, gets put in its place or something. Maybe swap it out for something identical. That sounds a little silly, but it would be a way to get around the obstacles that Van Inwagen notes. And he cites Paul's letter to the Corinthians, talking about how a naked kernel would be raised up in purity, a gumnos kokos, I believe. Gospels were written in Koine Greek, by the way. And that is one sketch of how it may be possible, along with some epistemic hedging about the limitations of our understanding and what might seem impossible at one point could seem possible later. But yes, maybe God saves your brain for later, and then uses it to put into a new body. What do you think of that? In any case, that's Peter Van Inwagen on the possibility of resurrection, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.